Hello and welcome to Deep Dive on NewsX World. I'm Ellie Richardson. In the ever-shifting sands of global diplomacy, the stakes have reached new heights. Over the last year, the US-Iran nuclear negotiations have unfolded like a high-stakes poker game. Now, the clock that was ticking has come to a sudden stop. US-Israel have struck Iran, killing hundreds and assassinating the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Let's dive deeper into the nuclear negotiations, that recent US-Israel strikes on Iran, and the challenging prospects of diplomacy. After months of tension, the world was watching as the US and Iran resumed indirect negotiations in early February 2026. The talks were mediated by Oman's Foreign Minister, Bad bin Hamad al-Basaidi, in a bid to ease tensions over Iran's nuclear program. While the US delegation, led by figures like Jared Kushner and CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper, expressed skepticism, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi echoed optimism. He described the discussions as a good start, but both sides seemed to be locked in a game of diplomatic chess with a few concrete advances. In the midst of these talks, key Iranian figures made it clear that Iran's stance on its nuclear ambitions remains firm. Araghchi, while noting the discussions were progressing, emphasized that Iran's missile program was non-negotiable, a red line for Tehran. Former Speaker of Iran's parliament, Ali Larijani, also joined the diplomatic push, making it clear that once a deal on the nuclear issue is struck, Iran is open to expanding the terms, but not before. But this time, the talks were not happening alone. US President Trump was doing something else simultaneously. Satellite imagery and open source tracking confirmed a significant US military buildup in the Middle East, focused on waters and bases within range of Iran. Analysis by fact-checking teams, including from BBC Verify, showed that the US Navy had positioned multiple warships and at least one major aircraft carrier strike group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, in the Arabian Sea and Gulf region near Iran. In late January and February, Washington also deployed a second carrier strike group around the USS Gerald R. Ford and moved large numbers of fighter jets, including advanced F-35S and F-22 Raptors, and combat aircraft into the region and nearby Allied air bases. This build-up was the largest concentration of US air and naval power in the Middle East since the 2003 Iraq War, and occurred amid rising tensions over Iran's nuclear program, its crackdown on domestic protests and stalled diplomacy. Later, on the 28th of January 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military strike deep inside Iran, marking one of the most dramatic escalations in Middle East conflict in decades. The offensive, described by Israeli officials as Operation Lion's Roar, targeted key strategic sites, including the Tehran compound of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, where he and other top officials were killed in the initial barrage. The strikes hit multiple Iranian military and leadership targets, including the defense minister, IRGC commander and Supreme Leader's military office chief, as US and Israeli forces aim to degrade Iran's nuclear missile and command air and control infrastructure. Satellite imagery showed significant damage to buildings in Tehran shortly after the attack began. The operation unfolded with precision strikes from both air and missile platforms and is being justified by Washington and Tel Aviv as necessary to counter Iran's nuclear capabilities and regional threats. Iran has since confirmed Khamenei's death and declared national mourning, while the broader fallout raises deep concerns about a wider regional conflict and the future of diplomatic efforts. So, reportedly, the reason for the strikes was to ensure Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. What's the evidence behind these claims? According to the International Atomic Agency, IAEA, there's no conclusive proof that Iran has an active nuclear weapons program, despite accumulating substantial stockpiles of 60% enriched uranium. These stocks are dangerously close to the 90% level required for weapons-grade material, which explains why both Israel and the US felt compelled to act. It was expected that after the strikes, negotiations would be immediately off the table. However, surprising many, President Trump stated on March the 1st that the US and Iran should resume talks. His statement echoed optimism, but there was no mention of an immediate breakthrough. Iran's response, however, was contrasting. Ali Larijani, and a key figure in Iran's political establishment, rejected the possibility of resuming negotiations after the airstrikes, suggesting that Iran's position on missile developments and other key issues remain non-negotiable. But the Iranian foreign minister stated the opposite. The leader reiterated that Iran has always been open to diplomacy. Listen in.
Well, Iran has been always open to diplomacy. And I think we have a very good record of that. Contrary to Americans, that their record is very bad and very negative. You know, this is the second time that we negotiated with Americans and they decided to attack us right in the middle of negotiation. So the first, rocket or missile or whatever that they fired hit the negotiation table. It happened exactly the same last June. We had another experience. We negotiated with them together with other members of P5+1, and we concluded a deal in 2015, and it was the US who withdrew with no justification, with no reason. And Iran remained committed to that deal as long as it was in place. So nobody can question Iran's good faith and readiness for diplomacy, for talk.
As tensions continue to mount, the world now finds itself at a crossroads. The US-Israel strikes, while presented as a necessary measure to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, have undoubtedly deepened the divide between the two nations. Yet the question remains, is the US truly committed to diplomacy, or are we witnessing another chapter in its long history of military intervention in the Middle East? How can the US claim the moral high ground when its actions have resulted in the death of one of the most powerful leaders in the region and the loss of hundreds of innocent lives? Dan Perry is now joining us, who is an international affairs expert, joining us from Tel Aviv. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us for this episode of Deep Dive. My first question for you is, while the US was engaged in Omani mediated talks led by Jared Kushner, it was simultaneously positioning the largest naval assembly since 2003. Was the diplomatic track a genuine attempt at a grand bargain, or was it a strategic deception operation designed to fix the Iranian leadership's location and lower their guard for Operation Epic Fury?
I think the United States has simply lost patience with the Iranian posture in the region over the past nearly half century, and with their method of negotiation, which is to buy time, to obfuscate endlessly, to quibble over every detail. I think the US was probably genuine in its willingness to not go to war, but less genuine in its willingness to compromise with the Iranian government. They were basically presenting an ultimatum, and they had terms, and those terms could fairly be described as terms of surrender for the Islamic Republic, by which I mean, of course, as has been repeatedly explained, no nuclear enrichment at a military level, no long-range ballistic missiles that can be used for aggression, and no further funding, training, arming, and guiding of militias around the region. Militias which have destabilized the Arab world for many, many decades. Iran was not a country minding its own business, merely oppressing its own people heinously and brutally, having committed a massacre just in the past 2 months of probably tens of thousands of people. Iran was actively destabilizing the Arab world and very clearly threatening the existence of Israel. So the idea of negotiating with them and where it was a negotiation in good faith is a little bit beside the point. When I think reality is that America, in the form and person of Donald Trump, had lost all patience with this basic situation that I have just described. And Iran's choice was more or less to capitulate or to face an attack. So you hear Larijani protesting that they were, attacked in the middle of negotiation. Negotiation is a modus operandi. And they have for many, many decades been negotiating while building up these capabilities. And they seem to think it's okay to have these capabilities. They seem to think it's okay for Iran to set up Hezbollah, which has obliterated Lebanon for decades, has made a mockery of Lebanon's sovereignty, and embroiled Lebanon in ruinous wars started by Hezbollah versus Israel. They think it's okay for Iraq to be controlled by Shiite militias that are controlled by Iran. They think it's okay for Iran to prop up Bashar Assad, that caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in Syria, and the Houthis that have caused the death of at least 400,000 people in the civil war in Yemen. I think it was game over for Iran. Khamenei and his cabal failed to realize that, and they paid the price. So the negotiations, I think, were only partly genuine in the sense that they were essentially a diktat. Iran rejected that diktat, and that was the outcome of the negotiation. You could argue that the procedure wasn't met properly, and I would agree with you. The way the U.S. carried out this war is extremely problematic in terms of international law. The argument in favor would be that there are points in history where procedure gets in the way and something decisive has to happen.
And how can the US justify such a drastic military response to Iran's nuclear program when, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, there is no conclusive proof of an active nuclear weapons program? Is this a case of US outreach or a calculated primitive strike?
I don't think the U.S. can particularly justify this kind of action based on a nuclear issue. I just assess that it was not about the nuclear issue. On the nuclear issue, Trump did a classic maneuver where he asked for more than he probably really wants. They demanded Iran does not enrich uranium at all, whereas Iran, as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has the right to enrich uranium at civilian levels for the use of energy and research. But Iran is, I believe, the only country in history that was enriching uranium to 60 and 80% levels, which is purely for weapons purposes, while denying they want a weapon, and they've been doing this for decades. So Iran lied about it. That was not relevant today because the U.S. claimed in June to have, I quote, obliterated whatever stockpiles they had and whatever capability they had. And so, yeah, I don't think the kind of action we've seen in the past several days is justified by the American position on Iranian nukes. But I also know it is not about the nukes. And you saw in the past couple of weeks, the U.S. trying to broaden the discussion to the ballistic missile program and the proxy militia program. And Iran, in both cases, rejected that. So, in fact, you had a negotiation, you had an American position putting those issues on the table. Those issues are justified, more than justified. Those issues are essential. Iran rejected it. And again, this is the consequence. Now, you have here a rogue regime that does not have the support of its people, clearly, that never did have the support of its people, that only exists on the strength of a falsified referendum in the spring of 1979, and that it massacres anyone who tries to affect change in Iran politically. That's the reality, and this is the outcome, but it's not about the nuclear issue. If we were to isolate it to nukes alone, then you'd be right. America has not a leg to stand on.
And despite claims of promoting diplomacy, how can the US continue to push for negotiations with Iran after such a dramatic military escalation, especially when those strikes resulted in the assassination of a key Iranian leader, their supreme leader? And does this move undermine the prospects for meaningful talks?
Precisely because this happened. I believe that Trump would like to further a narrative that says, you know what, we have changed the regime because the Supreme Leader and much, if not most, of his cabal of senior advisors and commanders is gone. So you now have a new leadership in Iran, and with that new leadership, I'd like to negotiate once again, this time testing whether they're going to be less indifferent to my demands. And in this case, even though Trump is a highly imperfect vessel and one of the world's least credible messengers of diplomacy, unfortunately, history has placed him at a juncture where he's right. And he is currently the oracle of trying to get Iran to trying to bring Iran to heel on these issues. And he'd be hoping that the new leadership is going to be more flexible than the previous one was. It's as simple as that.
And Ali Larijani rejected further talks, while Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi claimed Iran remains open to diplomacy. Does this indicate a burgeoning power struggle and within Tehran between the old guard and a surveillist faction?
Well, first of all, there always was a tension in Iran between the more moderate wing and the hardliners. So we can assume that those tensions will come into play presently. But beyond that, I would tend to discount almost anything said in public under the cloud of war and in the wake of the kind of trauma that the Islamic Republic has suffered in the past 48 hours. So it's not surprising Larijani says there's nothing to talk about. It's not surprising that the foreign minister feels otherwise. And I think perhaps a voice we need to wait for is Pezeshkian, the president. Pezeshkian is a doctor, not a cleric. What passes for a reformist, seems to, live in the modern world and understand what's going on. Probably knows the truth about things, probably understands something basic about history and geopolitics. And who knows, maybe if his voice prevails, then Iran will be open to what can be called diplomacy. But I repeat, I think what really is at hand is something more of a diktat. I don't think they have much leverage to deploy in trying to maintain the right to destabilize Arab countries through militias. I don't know how that continues. And I suspect that demand will remain etched in stone. And it's not impossible that the confidence that the U.S. might bring to bear in such future talks might include a demand for structural change in Iran. For example, very simple things. Anyone who runs for president in Iran has to be vetted by the clerics, the assembly of experts and the supreme leader. There's no reason for that. I mean, the constitution that was passed in 1979 is illegitimate and fake. I could see the world explaining to Iran that if they want to be welcomed back into the family of nations, that needs to change. And the fundamental guardrails of its theocracy need to be removed. And such a demand would, I think, meet with the approval of the vast majority of Iranians.
Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us here on this episode of Deep Dive. It's a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you. That's all we have time for this episode of Deep Dive. Stay tuned for more.